I grew up knowing, long before anyone ever said it out loud, that love in my family came with conditions. Some people are born into homes where affection is steady and unquestioned. Others learn early that attention has to be earned, explained, justified. I was the second kind. My name is Shotty Rivers, and for most of my life, I existed on the edges of my own family, watching from the sidelines as someone else took center stage. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal household. 2 parents, 2 daughters, a roof over our heads. But inside those walls, there was a quiet hierarchy that never changed. My younger sister, Talia, was the one everyone revolved around. Her needs were anticipated before she even voiced them. Mine were treated like inconveniences, interruptions in a story that wasn't really about me. Before we go on, please subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I really do read every comment. It wasn't that my parents were openly cruel. That almost would have been easier to understand. Instead, everything was wrapped in explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. They said they were teaching me independence. They said struggle builds character. They said I was strong enough to handle things on my own, and maybe that was true. But no one ever asked whether I wanted to be strong all the time. Whenever I needed something, even something small, I learned to prepare myself. Asking wasn't simple. It meant outlining my reasons, anticipating objections, bracing for disappointment. I would rehearse my words in my head, trying to sound responsible enough, mature enough, worthy enough. More often than not, the answer was still no. Or worse, a lecture about how money doesn't grow on trees and how life doesn't hand you anything for free. With Talia, it was different. She never had to explain herself. If she wanted something, it simply appeared. New clothes, spending money, things she liked just because she liked them. There was no speech about responsibility, no reminder about sacrifice. Watching that difference settle in day after day did something to me. I didn't resent her, not really. What hurt was the unspoken message that kept repeating itself in my head. You are on your own. As I got older, that message followed me everywhere. I stopped asking for help because I already knew the outcome. I learned how to swallow disappointment quickly, how to nod and say I understood when I didn't. I told myself that maybe this was normal, that families weren't supposed to be fair, that love didn't always look the way people described it. But even then, a small part of me hoped things would change. I believed that one day, my parents would notice how hard I was trying, that they would see my effort and meet me halfway. I didn't know yet how long I would be waiting, or how much it would cost me to keep believing that. By the time I reached my teenage years, that hope had learned how to stay quiet. It didn't disappear, but it stopped speaking up the way it used to. I focused on school, on keeping my head down, on doing everything right so there would be no reason to criticize me. I thought if I made myself small and capable enough, I would finally be seen. Money was always the clearest dividing line. With me, every request came with questions. Why do you need this? Can you do without it? Have you tried harder? I learned to treat asking like a negotiation I was destined to lose. Sometimes I would walk away halfway through explaining, already embarrassed by the sound of my own voice trying to justify something basic. My parents framed it as a lesson. They told me they were preparing me for the real world, that no one would ever hand me anything, that I needed to learn how to work myself to the bone if I wanted to survive. They repeated those words so often, they became background noise. Work hard, figure it out, don't rely on anyone. What they never acknowledged was how selectively those lessons were applied. Talia was never told to toughen up. No one asked her to prove why she deserved help. She lived in a different version of the same house, one where support was automatic and mistakes were softened by reassurance. When she struggled, my parents stepped in. When I struggled, they stepped back. I remember watching her pack for milestones I never got to imagine for myself. New opportunities unfolded for her like they were expected. For me, the future felt like a narrow hallway with no doors, just a long stretch of effort and uncertainty. I didn't complain. I didn't argue. I internalized the idea that needing help was a personal failure. When conversations about college started at school, everything came into sharp focus. Teachers talked about applications and financial aid and planning ahead. For a moment, I let myself picture something different, a path that wasn't just survival, a chance to build something for myself that didn't start with exhaustion. That illusion didn't last long. My parents were clear when the subject came up at home. They told me they would not be contributing to my education in any way. No savings, no assistance, not even paperwork to see what options might exist. If I wanted to go, they said, I would have to take on the debt and the burden alone. Even when my guidance counselor tried to step in, the answer didn't change. My parents insisted that this was part of my lesson. That responsibility meant carrying everything myself. Listening to them talk, it became obvious that my future was something they felt detached from. They weren't invested in where I ended up, only in making sure they weren't involved. I went home that day with a knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen. I lay awake thinking about loans, about years of repayment, about starting adult life already underwater. I weighed every possibility against the reality that no one was going to catch me if I fell. And slowly, painfully, I made a decision that would shape everything that came after. I chose not to go, not because I didn't want to learn, but because I didn't want a lifetime of debt hanging over me before I even had a chance to breathe. My parents accepted that choice without much reaction. To them, it didn't change anything. I was still expected to find my own way, and so I did, even as I watched my sister move forward with every door held open in front of her. Choosing not to go to college felt less like a decision and more like a surrender. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't announce it. I just adjusted my expectations and started planning how to survive without a safety net. While my classmates talked about dorms and majors, I focused on finding work, on making sure I could cover my own needs without asking anyone for help I already knew wouldn't come. There was a strange kind of loneliness in that. Not the dramatic kind people talk about, but a quiet realization that your life is unfolding without witnesses. Every small step I took was mine alone. Every mistake, every setback, every minor victory happened without applause or concern. I learned how to budget because I had to. I learned how to say no to myself because no one else was going to step in and help. At the same time, my parents' involvement in Talia's life only seemed to grow. While I was figuring things out one expense at a time, she was preparing for college with excitement instead of fear. They paid for everything she needed: tuition, fees, living costs. They even sent her extra money so she wouldn't have to worry while she was away. Watching that from the outside felt surreal, like we were characters in two entirely different stories that happened to share the same last name. I told myself not to compare. I repeated that over and over, like a mantra. Comparison only leads to bitterness, I said. Everyone's path is different. But some nights, when I was exhausted and lying awake, replaying conversations in my head, the unfairness pressed down on me anyway. Not because I wanted what she had, but because I couldn't understand why I had been denied even the option. My parents never tried to hide their reasoning. They spoke openly about how proud they were to support Talia, how important her education was, how they wanted her to have every opportunity. Those words stung in a way I couldn't explain without sounding ungrateful. So I stayed quiet. I learned to nod, to smile, to keep my feelings contained. As the years passed, that silence hardened into something heavier. I wasn't angry all the time. Mostly, I was tired. Tired of being the one who had to be strong. Tired of hearing lectures about independence when independence had never been a choice for me, only a requirement. I wondered if my parents ever noticed how little they asked about my life, how rarely they checked in unless something went wrong. I built my routine around self-reliance, work, bills, responsibilities. I didn't expect help anymore, and in a strange way, that expectation freed me. When you assume no one is coming to rescue you, you stop waiting. You just move forward because you have to. Still, there was a part of me that held on to a quiet hope that one day, the imbalance would be acknowledged. That hope wasn't loud. It didn't demand apologies or grand gestures. It simply wished for recognition. For someone to say, "We see how hard this has been for you." That moment never came. And by the time everything changed, I had already learned how to live without it. As I settled into adulthood, the distance between my life and Talia's became impossible to ignore. Not because I was failing, but because I was constantly reminded of how differently our paths had been shaped. I worked steadily, paid my own way, and learned how to stretch every dollar further than it was meant to go. There was pride in that, even if it was mixed with fatigue. I had built something stable for myself, piece by piece, without anyone lifting a finger to help. Meanwhile, my parents continued to be deeply involved in Talia's life. They spoke about her accomplishments with a kind of excitement I recognized, but never experienced firsthand. When she visited home from school, the house seemed to revolve around her presence. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Plans adjusted around her schedule. I noticed these things quietly, like someone taking notes they never intended to share. I rarely talked about my own struggles. Not because they didn't exist, but because I had learned there was no space for them. Whenever I hinted at being overwhelmed, the response was always the same. "You're strong. You'll figure it out. You always do." What sounded like encouragement slowly revealed itself as an expectation. Strength wasn't admired. It was assumed. There were moments when I wondered if my parents even realized how unequal everything had been. Part of me wanted to believe it wasn't intentional, that they didn't wake up each day deciding to give more to one daughter and less to the other. But intention mattered less than impact. The result was the same. I had grown up feeling like an obligation, while Talia was treated like an investment. Over time, I stopped trying to explain myself. I stopped hoping that effort alone would earn me the same consideration. I focused instead on building a life that didn't depend on approval. That shift wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, in small choices, in learning not to call when things went wrong, in handling problems privately, in letting go of the idea that fairness would eventually balance itself out. Still, family has a way of pulling you back into old patterns. No matter how independent I became, I was never fully free from the roles we had been assigned. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the daughter who didn't ask for much. At first, that identity felt like protection. Later, it would become the reason everyone felt entitled to lean on me. I didn't know it yet, but the years of uneven support were quietly adding up. Decisions made long ago were setting the stage for a reckoning no one had planned for. I was living my life under the assumption that I was invisible. My parents were living theirs under the assumption that I would always be there. And eventually, those two beliefs were bound to collide. The first time my parents mentioned money in a way that felt different, I didn't think much of it. At first, it sounded like casual frustration. Rising costs, unexpected expenses. Small comments slipped into conversations and then quickly brushed aside. I listened, nodded, and moved on, the way I always had. Their financial worries didn't feel like something that belonged to me. But over time, the tone shifted. Those passing remarks turned heavier, more deliberate. They started talking about how difficult things had become, how stretched they were, how they weren't sure how they were going to manage much longer. I could hear the stress in their voices. But what struck me most was how familiar the dynamic felt. Once again, I was being positioned as the listener, the one expected to absorb the weight without being affected by it. Eventually, the truth came out. My parents had run out of money. Years of supporting Talia, of paying for her education and continuing to help her financially, had drained their resources. They had borrowed to keep up with those expenses, convinced that it was the right thing to do. Now, the bills were piling up, and the choices in front of them were growing darker by the day. They told me they weren't sure if they could keep up with basic necessities. Food, utilities, the simple things people take for granted. Hearing that made my chest tighten. Not because I felt responsible, but because it forced me to confront something I had spent years avoiding. The moment had arrived where they expected me to step in. When they asked for help, it wasn't framed as a discussion. There was no acknowledgement of the past. No reflection on how differently they had treated their daughters. It was presented as something natural, almost inevitable, as if my role as the dependable one meant I would automatically say yes. I remember staring at my phone after that conversation ended, my thoughts spiraling in every direction at once. Part of me felt guilt, sharp and immediate. The idea of saying no to your own parents doesn't sit easily in your chest. It presses against everything you've been taught about family and obligation. But another part of me felt something else entirely. Exhaustion. A deep, bone-level tiredness that had nothing to do with money. I thought about all the times I had been told to figure it out on my own. About being denied help when I was younger and more vulnerable. About how independence had never been encouraged as a choice, only imposed as a rule. And I wondered why that rule seemed to disappear now that they needed something from me. When I finally spoke, my voice was steadier than I expected. I told them no. I said I couldn't help, and I told them that if they needed support, they should ask Talia, the daughter they had invested everything in. The words didn't come from anger. They came from clarity. The reaction was immediate and intense. My parents were furious. They accused me of being cold, of turning my back on family when it mattered most. Talia called me unfair. She said I was older, that I should take responsibility, that I should do the right thing. Listening to her speak, I realized how deeply the roles had been ingrained in all of us. After those conversations ended, the silence felt heavy. I sat alone, replaying every word, every accusation. Doubt crept in quietly. Was I wrong for setting this boundary? Was I being selfish? Or was this simply the first time I had refused to carry a burden that was never meant to be mine alone? The days that followed were some of the most uncomfortable I had experienced in years. Not because of open conflict, but because of the weight of unspoken expectations pressing in from every direction. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Phone calls felt tense, clipped, as if everyone was waiting for me to change my mind and restore the balance they were used to. I questioned myself constantly. I replayed my childhood in fragments, searching for moments that might justify their anger. I wondered if I was rewriting the past to protect my own feelings, if maybe I had misunderstood their intentions all along. Guilt has a way of making you doubt even the things you know are true. But each time I started to waver, I returned to the same memories. being told no when I asked for help, being reminded that their money was not for me, being expected to absorb disappointment quietly and move on without complaint. Those weren't imagined moments. They were patterns that had shaped the person I became. What hurt the most wasn't their need. It was the absence of reflection. No one asked how it felt to be excluded for so long. No one acknowledged that the situation they were in was the result of choices made over many years. Instead, the focus remained on me and what I was refusing to do. Talia's reaction stung in a different way. I didn't blame her for the way she had been treated growing up. Children accept the roles they're given. But hearing her frame my boundary as selfish forced me to confront how normalized the imbalance had become. To her, support had always been automatic. To me, it had always been conditional. I noticed how easily everyone fell back into familiar language. Family helps family. You're stronger than this. You'll figure it out. Those phrases had followed me my entire life, but now they felt heavier, almost accusatory. Strength, in this context, wasn't admiration. It was an excuse to demand more. As the noise settled, something unexpected happened. Beneath the guilt and doubt, there was a quiet sense of relief. For the first time, I wasn't bending myself to fit a role that drained me. I wasn't explaining or defending my needs. I had simply stated a boundary and held it. That didn't make everything easier. I still felt the pull of obligation. I still worried about how this decision would change our relationships. But I also felt a small shift inside myself, like a muscle I had never used before, finally being activated. I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating other people's reactions instead of listening to my own limits. I didn't know what the future would look like after this. I didn't know if the distance would grow or if understanding would ever follow. All I knew was that for once, I wasn't acting out of fear. I wasn't saying yes to avoid conflict. I was standing still and allowing discomfort to exist without immediately trying to fix it. That choice didn't resolve everything. It didn't offer closure or reassurance. But it marked the first time I recognized that protecting myself wasn't the same as abandoning others. It was simply an acknowledgement that I had needs too, even if no one else was used to seeing them. As the initial shock wore off, I began to see how deeply this moment was tied to everything that came before it. This wasn't just about money. It was about years of unspoken expectations finally coming to the surface. For so long, I had been cast as the reliable one, the daughter who would adapt, endure, and absorb whatever was placed on her shoulders. Saying no disrupted that image, and the discomfort it caused rippled outward. I started noticing how often my family framed my independence as proof that I didn't need support. The very resilience they had demanded from me was now being used as justification for why I should give more. It felt like a trap I had been walking toward my entire life without realizing it. If I struggled, I was told to work harder. If I succeeded, it meant I owed something back. That realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. I saw how rarely anyone had asked what I wanted or needed. Decisions about my life had been made under the assumption that I would simply adjust. And for a long time, I had. I mistook adaptability for strength and silence for maturity. Only now was I beginning to understand the cost of that misunderstanding. I tried to imagine the situation from my parents' perspective. I knew fear was driving some of their reactions. Being in debt, not knowing how to cover basic expenses, can make anyone desperate. But desperation doesn't erase history. It doesn't undo years of unequal treatment. Wanting to help them didn't mean ignoring how we got here. There were moments when I almost reached out, ready to soften my stance, to offer something just to ease the tension. Each time, I paused. I asked myself whether I was acting out of compassion or conditioning, whether I was responding to their needs or to the familiar discomfort of disappointing them. That question stopped me every time. I realized how rarely I had been allowed to sit with my own feelings. There was always pressure to move past them quickly, to be understanding, to not make things difficult. Now, for the first time, I gave myself permission to feel everything without rushing toward resolution. The sadness, the anger, the grief for a version of family I had hoped for, but never quite had. In that space, something shifted. I began to see that boundaries weren't walls meant to punish others. They were lines drawn to protect parts of myself that had gone unguarded for too long. I wasn't closing the door on my family. I was opening one for myself. I didn't announce this realization. I didn't turn it into a declaration. It existed quietly, guiding my choices in subtle ways. I answered messages when I had the capacity to do so. I ended conversations when they became circular or accusatory. I stopped trying to convince anyone that my feelings were valid. I let them be valid on their own. That didn't fix the situation. It didn't bring immediate understanding or reconciliation. But it gave me something I had been missing for a long time. A sense of agency. The knowledge that I could choose how much of myself to give and when. And that choice, once recognized, was something I knew I wouldn't easily give up again. With time, the intensity of the reactions softened, but the underlying tension remained. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the careful way words were chosen, in what was no longer said. I noticed how often my parents spoke as if this was a temporary misunderstanding, something that would resolve itself once I came to my senses. That assumption lingered, quiet but persistent. I found myself reflecting on how often I had been expected to compromise in the past. Compromise had always meant giving a little more of myself, adjusting my expectations, accepting less. It had never been mutual. Looking back, I could see how easily love had been confused with compliance. If I didn't push back, things stayed peaceful. If I did, I became the problem. That realization was uncomfortable, but it explained so much. It explained why my refusal felt so disruptive. I had stepped outside the role everyone understood me to play. And once you do that, there's no easy way to step back in without losing something important. I began to pay closer attention to my own reactions. When my phone rang, I noticed the tightness in my chest before I even looked at the screen. When messages came through, I felt the urge to explain myself all over again, to soften my words, to reassure everyone that I wasn't trying to hurt them. Each time, I stopped. I reminded myself that clarity didn't require repetition. I had already said what I needed to say. In quieter moments, I allowed myself to grieve. Not just the conflict, but the years of imbalance that had led here. I grieved the idea of parents who would have shown up for me without conditions. I grieved the version of myself who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. That grief was heavy, but it was also honest. I thought about how differently my life might have unfolded if support had been evenly distributed, not in a way that fueled resentment, but in a way that acknowledged reality. Opportunities shape confidence. Safety changes how you take risks. These truths didn't make my parents villains, but they did make their choices matter. At the same time, I recognized my own resilience. I had built a life without a cushion, without guarantees. That mattered. It was something I could honor without letting it become a weapon used against me. Strength, I realized, doesn't mean endless endurance. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop carrying what isn't yours. I didn't know what the long-term outcome would be. Families don't reset overnight. Patterns that take decades to form don't disappear because of one boundary. But I also knew that whatever came next would be shaped by honesty rather than obligation. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how useful I was to others. I wasn't proving my love through sacrifice. I was learning how to exist without apologizing for taking up space. That lesson didn't come with celebration or relief. It came quietly, through reflection and resolve. And it stayed with me, steady and grounding, even as everything else felt uncertain. There were moments when I wondered if holding this boundary would permanently change how my family saw me. The thought was unsettling. No matter how old you get, there is a part of you that still wants to be understood by the people who raised you. I wrestled with that desire daily, asking myself whether peace was worth the cost of self-betrayal. I replayed conversations from my childhood with new awareness. Comments that once seemed harmless now revealed patterns I hadn't questioned before. Praise was scarce, concern selective. When I succeeded, it was expected. When Talia succeeded, it was celebrated. I had absorbed that contrast without protest, assuming it was simply the way things were. Understanding it now didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it shape. It allowed me to name what I had felt all those years without sounding dramatic or ungrateful. Neglect doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like being present but overlooked, acknowledged only when convenient. I also noticed how quickly responsibility had been reassigned once my parents' circumstances changed. Independence, once demanded of me, suddenly became negotiable when it no longer served them. That contradiction was hard to ignore. It confirmed what I had been reluctant to admit. Expectations in my family were flexible, but only in one direction. As difficult as this realization was, it freed me from a certain kind of confusion. I stopped asking why things had been different. I stopped searching for explanations that might make it hurt less. Some questions don't have answers that bring comfort. They only have truths that ask to be accepted. I focused on what I could control, my choices, my reactions, the way I spoke to myself when doubt crept in. I reminded myself that boundaries don't require permission. They don't need unanimous approval to be valid. They exist to protect your capacity to live honestly. There were days when I felt strong in that knowledge, and days when it felt fragile. Growth wasn't linear. Some mornings I woke up confident in my decision. Other days I felt the old pull to apologize, to smooth things over, to make everything easier for everyone else. Each time I paused and asked myself the same question: am I choosing this out of fear or out of respect for myself? Slowly, the answer came more easily. The fear lost its grip. I began to trust my own judgment in a way I never had before. That trust didn't come from external validation. It came from listening inward, from honoring the experiences that had shaped me instead of dismissing them. I didn't know if my family would ever see things the way I did. I didn't know if understanding would replace resentment. But I did know that whatever happened, I would no longer abandon myself to preserve an image of harmony that had never truly included me. That realization marked a turning point, quiet but profound, in how I understood my place in the world. As the weeks passed, I noticed how my inner world had begun to shift, even if the outside circumstances hadn't changed much at all. The same conversations still circled back to the same points. The same expectations lingered in the air. But my response to them was different. I was no longer constantly bracing myself, anticipating the next demand or accusation. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't shaped by my family's approval. That idea felt unfamiliar, almost forbidden. So much of my identity had been built around being dependable, being reasonable, being the one who didn't cause trouble. Letting go of that role felt like stepping into open space without knowing where I would land. I began to notice how often I had minimized my own experiences to keep the peace. I had learned to tell stories about my life in ways that sounded lighter than they felt. I had downplayed the stress, the isolation, the constant pressure to perform independence flawlessly. Admitting that truth to myself was uncomfortable, but it was also grounding. There was a quiet strength in no longer needing to explain every decision. I didn't owe anyone a breakdown of my finances or a justification for my limits. I didn't need to convince anyone that my choice was reasonable. It was enough that it felt right to me. That realization extended beyond my family. I started noticing similar patterns in other areas of my life. How often I said yes out of habit. How quickly I stepped in to solve problems that weren't mine. How rarely I asked myself what I actually wanted before responding. Setting one boundary had opened my eyes to many others I had been neglecting. I didn't become distant or cold. I didn't stop caring. But I did stop overextending myself in the name of being liked or approved of. I learned that caring doesn't have to mean sacrificing your stability. Love doesn't have to require self-erasure. There were moments of sadness, especially when I thought about how different things might have been. I allowed myself to sit with that sadness without rushing to fix it. Grief, I realized, isn't always about loss in the present. Sometimes it's about mourning what never existed in the first place. Through all of this, I stayed grounded in one truth. My decision wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognizing that I deserved the same consideration I had been taught to deny myself. That acknowledgement didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came quietly, settling into my life like a steady foundation. I still don't know how my family will choose to move forward. That part is out of my hands. What I do know is that I no longer measure my worth by how much I give until it hurts. I measure it by how honestly I show up for myself. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, has changed everything. There was a calm that followed this shift, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that makes it easier to carry. I began to understand that I didn't need immediate resolution for things to feel different. Some changes happen internally long before they're reflected in the world around you. Accepting that allowed me to breathe more freely. I stopped waiting for my parents to acknowledge the imbalance. I stopped hoping for an apology that might never come. That hope had quietly drained me for years, and letting it go felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. It didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped hinging my sense of peace on someone else's awareness. I paid closer attention to how I spoke to myself. For a long time, my inner voice had echoed the same messages I'd heard growing up. Be reasonable. Don't ask for too much. You can handle it. Now, I challenged those reflexes. I asked myself what support would look like if I allowed myself to want it. Even when the answer was uncertain, the question itself felt radical. In conversations with my family, I became more measured. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. When the subject of money came up, I repeated my boundary calmly and consistently. The lack of emotional escalation surprised them. It surprised me too. I realized how often conflict feeds on reaction. Removing that fuel changed the dynamic, even if it didn't resolve it. I also noticed how my parents framed their situation to others. Their words carried an undertone of disappointment, of confusion about why I wouldn't step in. Hearing that stung, but it also clarified something important. They were still telling the story from their perspective alone, and I was no longer obligated to correct it. I focused instead on building a life that felt steady and self-directed. I invested my energy in my work, my routines, the relationships that didn't require me to shrink. I surrounded myself with people who listened without waiting for their turn to speak, who didn't see my boundaries as threats, but as expressions of self-respect. Through all of this, I learned that growth doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like choosing not to engage in the same arguments over and over again, like allowing others to sit with their discomfort without rushing in to ease it for them. That restraint wasn't coldness, it was clarity. And with clarity came a sense of alignment I hadn't felt before. I was no longer acting against myself to maintain a fragile sense of peace. I was choosing consistency over approval, honesty over habit. I didn't know where this path would ultimately lead, but for the first time, I trusted myself to walk it without constantly looking back. That trust, once established, became something I guarded carefully. It was earned through years of silence and finally claimed through one simple word I had never allowed myself to say before. No. Saying no did not suddenly make life simple, but it did make it clearer. I began to notice how much mental space had been occupied by anticipating my family's needs and reactions. Without that constant background noise, there was room to think about my own priorities in a way I never had before. It felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent, to consider what I wanted without immediately weighing how it might affect everyone else. I became more intentional with my time. I stopped rearranging my schedule to be available at a moment's notice. I let calls go to voicemail when I wasn't in the right headspace to talk. At first, that choice came with a rush of anxiety, as if I were breaking an unspoken rule. Over time, the anxiety softened. Nothing terrible happened when I chose myself. The world didn't collapse. I simply remained where I was, intact. I also started to reflect on how deeply I had internalized the idea that love had to be earned. That belief had shaped not only my relationship with my family, but with myself. I had treated rest like a reward instead of a necessity. I had viewed my own needs as obstacles to be managed rather than signals to be respected. Letting go of that mindset required patience. Old habits don't disappear just because you recognize them. There were still moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, I would wonder if I had misjudged the situation, if maybe I should have handled things differently. In those moments, I returned to the facts. I remembered the years of uneven support. I remembered being told, again and again, that I was on my own. Those memories grounded me when emotion threatened to blur the edges. I also recognized that my parents' disappointment did not automatically mean I was wrong. Discomfort can be a sign that something necessary is happening. Growth rarely feels gentle to everyone involved. Accepting that helped me release the urge to make my choices palatable for others. Slowly, my sense of self became less reactive. I wasn't constantly measuring my decisions against potential criticism. I was learning to stand behind them quietly, without needing to convince anyone else. That confidence wasn't loud or defiant. It was steady. It showed up in small ways, in how I spoke, how I listened, how I carried myself. I began to see my life not as a series of obligations, but as something I was actively shaping. That shift brought both responsibility and freedom. Responsibility because I could no longer blame my circumstances for every limitation. Freedom because I was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. The relationship with my family remained complicated. Love didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became less about proximity and more about boundaries. Less about approval and more about honesty. I didn't know if they would ever understand my perspective. What mattered was that I finally understood my own. With that understanding came a new kind of patience. Not the patience that asks you to endure quietly, but the patience that allows things to unfold without forcing them. I stopped monitoring every interaction for signs of progress or regret. I stopped trying to interpret silence as either punishment or reconciliation. I let it be what it was. I noticed how my body responded to this shift before my mind fully caught up. I slept more deeply. My shoulders felt less tense. Conversations that once left me drained no longer carried the same weight, because I no longer entered them with the expectation that I had to fix anything. I could listen without absorbing responsibility. I also began to understand how deeply fear had guided my earlier choices. Fear of being seen as ungrateful, fear of being labeled selfish, fear of losing whatever fragile connection still existed. Naming that fear didn't make it disappear, but it gave me distance from it. I could see it for what it was, rather than letting it decide for me. There were moments when my parents tried to revisit the conversation, framing it as concern or confusion. I responded with the same calm explanation, without adding new details or defending myself. Each time, the exchange ended more quickly than the last. Repetition lost its power when it no longer provoked a reaction. I thought often about the version of myself who would have folded under that pressure, the one who would have said yes just to restore a sense of normalcy. I felt compassion for her. She had done what she needed to survive at the time, but I also felt gratitude that I was no longer living from that place. I began to invest in things that had nothing to do with proving my worth. Simple routines, small goals that belonged only to me, moments of rest without guilt attached. These weren't grand transformations, but they were meaningful. They signaled a shift from endurance to intention. I realized that choosing myself didn't mean rejecting my family. It meant refusing to disappear within the dynamics that had defined us for so long. It meant acknowledging that love without boundaries eventually becomes resentment, and resentment helps no one. There was still sadness, especially when I thought about what could have been different. I let that sadness exist without trying to rationalize it away. Some losses don't need solutions, they need acknowledgement. Allowing myself that honesty felt like another small act of self-respect. As time went on, I felt less urgency to explain my choices to anyone else. My life didn't need to be a lesson or a statement. It just needed to be lived in a way that felt true. That quiet confidence became my anchor, steadying me even when old doubts tried to resurface. I didn't know what the future held for my family relationships. That uncertainty no longer frightened me the way it once did. I had learned that stability doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from finally standing on your own terms, without apology. By this point, I no longer felt the need to revisit every detail of the past in order to justify my present. The story was what it was. It had shaped me, challenged me, and forced me to grow in ways I hadn't chosen. But it no longer defined every decision I made. I carried it with me, but I didn't let it steer me. I started to understand that closure doesn't always arrive as a conversation or an apology. Sometimes it shows up as acceptance. Acceptance that people may never see you the way you need them to. Acceptance that fairness isn't guaranteed, even within families. Acceptance that waiting for others to change can keep you stuck longer than any boundary ever could. There were moments when I caught myself imagining how things might have unfolded if circumstances were different. If support had been shared evenly. If encouragement had come without conditions. Those thoughts still surfaced, but they no longer consumed me. I acknowledged them, then let them pass, like weather moving through. I also became more aware of how easily old roles try to reassert themselves. A familiar tone in a conversation. A subtle expectation implied, but not stated. Each time, I noticed it sooner than before. Awareness gave me choice. I could engage, redirect, or step back without spiraling into guilt. What surprised me most was how this shift affected my sense of peace. It wasn't dramatic or euphoric. It was quiet, steady, and sustainable. I felt more present in my own life. More grounded in decisions that reflected who I was now, not who I had been trained to be. I realized that strength doesn't always mean enduring more. Sometimes it means enduring less. Choosing rest, choosing clarity, choosing to stop negotiating your worth with people who benefit from you doubting it. That understanding changed how I measured progress. It was no longer about how much I could handle, but about how well I could care for myself. I didn't know if my family would ever fully accept this version of me. That uncertainty no longer dictated my choices. I had learned that belonging doesn't require self-sacrifice. That love, to be healthy, has to leave room for boundaries. And that choosing yourself is not an act of rejection, but an act of survival. As I moved forward, I carried these lessons quietly. I didn't need to announce them or prove them. They lived in the way I spoke, the way I listened, the way I honored my limits. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty. I would no longer disappear in order to keep the peace. Looking back now, I understand that this story was never really about money. It was about visibility. About what happens when one child grows up learning that love is abundant, while another learns that love must be rationed and earned. For years, I tried to make sense of that imbalance by working harder, asking for less, and telling myself it didn't matter. But it did matter. It shaped how I saw myself and what I believed I was allowed to need. I don't know what my parents tell themselves now when they think about everything that's happened. I don't know if they see the connection between the choices they made and the distance that exists today. I've learned that some understanding may never come, and waiting for it only keeps old wounds open. What I do know is that I no longer need their realization in order to validate my own experience. Choosing myself didn't come with a dramatic turning point or a single moment of triumph. It came quietly through repetition, through saying no more than once, through sitting with discomfort instead of rushing to erase it, through recognizing that my value was never tied to how much I could endure for others. If you listened all the way to the end, thank you. It truly means more to me than you know. Before we wrap up, go ahead and like this video and share it if the story blessed you. Today, I move forward with a deeper sense of respect for myself. I no longer confuse sacrifice with love or silence with strength. I understand that boundaries are not walls meant to punish, but lines that protect what matters most. And for the first time, I feel grounded in the knowledge that choosing myself was never selfish. It was necessary. For another story that fits your mood, click the video on the left. To hear the latest one, choose the video on the right.
Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Hopefully every moment in the story has touched your heart, brought you some reflection, some emotion, and hope. Thank you for taking the time to experience it with us, and hope that each next story will always accompany you on your life journey.